Welcome back to On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. Today we talked to Mike Smith about his escape from China. Mike was the Australian Financial Review's correspondent in Shanghai until he and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Bill Birtles were caught up in a diplomatic standoff between the two countries. Mike and Bill were first banned from leaving as part of China's investigation into a third Australian journalist, Chinese-born Cheng Lei, who works for state media. Cheng has been in police detention since late August. Mike was at Australia's consulate in Shanghai under diplomatic protection for 5 days before eventually being allowed to leave. That's coming up later in the pod. But first, Kevin O'Rourke, author of the newsletter Reformasi Weekly. 6 months since the outbreak began, Indonesia's daily total of new infections continues to set records. Jakarta is in a lockdown, closing gyms and banning dining inside restaurants for a second time. Authorities need to slow the spread of COVID because the capital is running out of hospital beds. I wanted to talk to Kevin because he's been following the pandemic closely, charting out the rate of increase of active cases and arguing, until recently, that Indonesia may have been avoiding the worst of the pandemic so far. Now he says testing is falling so far behind, it's hard to know the true state of the outbreak. I spoke with Kevin last week and began by asking him why authorities still haven't ramped up testing. The country's averaging 3,000 a day and positivity rate is hovering at about 20% for days now. That's versus the World Health Organization's recommendation of only 5%. Jakarta and its surrounds have re-entered a lockdown. They're worried about beds running out. And I wanted to get our friend of the pod, Kevin O'Rourke, back, author of Reformasi Weekly, who could shed some light on the numbers. You've been following this very closely ever since the beginning of the pandemic, Kevin. And what I've liked about your analysis is that you've taken the focus for lazy journalists. The focus has been about the ongoing rise in the absolute number of cases and the day-to-day increase in infections, which is important, but you've dug down consistently into the active numbers of cases and charted their rate of increase or decrease over time, using moving averages to sort out the sudden spikes and the troughs to get an accurate picture. And up until this point, you've been urging caution that, Indonesia has it bad, but is not as bad as in other places. But in your most recent piece, your most recent note that came out on Friday, you've said that Indonesia has entered into a terra incognita, an India type scenario is not impossible, whereby the pandemic spirals out of control. That almost, in fact, I think at one point you say the data from the testing is almost meaningless because it's not capturing enough of the problem. How bad is it?
Right. Yeah. Well, you've pretty much summed up everything I had to say. So.
Right. Okay. Well, that's going to be the shortest pod we've had. But that really scares me because we've seen what happened in India, we've seen what happened in Brazil and in the United States, and in Indonesia was a sort of wait a minute, it's not that bad. Maybe by sheer luck, for reasons that we don't fully understand, because we don't know. There's still a lot we don't know about this virus. For some reason, it isn't hitting Indonesia quite as badly. What got us to this point? Let's start maybe with testing then. We're nowhere near, you say, the levels of testing that we need. In fact, testing rates have come down. Have you been able to find any reasons for the lack of testing and the fact that it's been so inconsistent?
Yeah, there's been multiple problems, and there are a couple of ways to measure the adequacy of testing. The WHO has a couple of guidelines, one for the number of tests per 1,000 population conducted overall, and then the other one is the positivity rate, so the number of PCR or molecular tests coming back positive And it's on this latter measure that Indonesia's testing has been just about adequate until now nationally, but then just lately, starting in late August, the positivity rate really rose quite a bit. So the WHO guideline was a positivity rate of below 10% is what they recommended, and then they changed that to recommend less than 5%. And a lot of places in the world are maintaining positivity rates well below that. Indonesia was always around the 10 or 12% level for a long time, and then just in late August it soared up to 20% because the growth in testing just has not been able to keep up with the increased infections. Even though the increase in infections is modest and moderate compared to most countries in the world, the fact that the testing hasn't just been able to roll out in lockstep means that now the situation is what I would call terra incognita, whereby the testing is not enough to measure the true scope of the epidemic. You're getting one test out of 5 coming back positive, so that implies that there's a lot of other cases out there that are not being captured. And so at that point, then it's very difficult to accurately judge the trends and the directions and then the nuances of the data because the data is just incomplete. And this is applicable nationwide, but also for Jakarta, which has been about a third of national cases throughout. The positivity rate specifically just for the city of Jakarta, which actually accounts for almost 50% of all tests conducted, is also very high at about 18% just in the past couple of days. So the infections are just outpacing the testing in Jakarta. And then the what infections data does exist shows that there's been an acceleration in the growth. So if you look at the weekly growth of total cases detected to date in Jakarta, that had been in the single digits in June, and then the low teens in July, and the mid-teens in August, and it's been up around 16 or 17% in September. So there is an acceleration happening there, and with the testing being limited, there's a real need for an intervention, I think, and that's why I think it's warranted to implement tighter restrictions now.
And that met with quite a lot of resistance from the central government cabinet. Cabinet ministers came out one after the other saying that it wasn't necessary. I think eventually some agreement has been made, but there's a number of exceptions. I was just out on the street today, and it looks like just like any other Monday. Who has the final authority for places like Jakarta?
Well, typically in Indonesia, these types of questions are very vague and unclear, but in this case, it just so happens that there's a recent modern, well-crafted law which is very specific, which is an unusual situation for Indonesia.
Wow.
And that's the natural disaster law of 2018, and it says very clearly that it's the health minister who determines when to impose restrictions because of epidemics. So the central government's health minister, and in this case, that's Terawan Putranto, is a retired 3-star Army general who's been a real lightning rod for controversy throughout the pandemic. But a health ministry official, not Terawan, but Yuri, who's the director general and the former spokesperson for the COVID task force, said last week that the health ministry already granted carte blanche to Jakarta to declare its own restrictions as the province deems necessary. So that authority was already devolved to the Jakarta governor in June. And therefore, it's up to the governor, Anies Baswedan, to do as he likes. However, in practice, that's not what happened. It looks on the surface, judging from events, that the governor faced resistance from tycoons and business interests who then influenced ministers, who then compelled the governor to make compromises.
And that's precisely what you don't want, especially in a city like Jakarta or in a country like Indonesia, where so much of the economy is informal, where it's really hard to get people to stay home when not working can be the difference between being able to eat not very far down the line. I mean, that's not hyperbole.
Mm,
People live hand to
mm,
mouth. Very large, millions of people do in the city alone, and
yeah.
having that discord, it just seems it seems reprehensible to me. What okay, do you see any sort of political blowback for Anis, who's pushing for the restrictions, or perhaps for the president Joko Widodo or Jokowi, who is taking a softer approach? Like, but with the way looking at it for me,
Hmm.
if he pushes back, if the Widodo administration pushes back, and there is a sudden explosion in infections, as can happen with these things, as we've seen
Hmm.
around the world, every fatality gets laid on his doorstep. Why would he
Yeah.
want a piece of that?
Yeah, it's a real risk on Widodo's part to do this to basically overrule the governor almost. That's a very risky move on his part because you're looking at the trends and infections that we have and plus the positivity rate for Jakarta. It looks as if the possibility of the curves reaching takeoff are real, and especially given the pattern of the epidemic in other countries where second waves have hit certain countries, or as you mentioned in India, where suddenly after relatively moderate growth, there was a real acceleration all of a sudden. Something to be vigilant about. And here, the central government appears to be taking quite a cavalier approach, or yeah, emphasizing economic growth when in fact the best way to sustain economic growth or mitigate the impacts is to handle the epidemic and keep infections in check and within an amount that allows for tracing and isolation, and that's precisely what's getting out of hand right now.
And managing the number of beds, right? That's like, if so
Yeah,
long as there are beds
capacity.
and
Yeah.
adequate the capacity in the hospitals in the COVID, the referral hospitals. And not all
Mm.
hospitals are created equal. There are some that are there's a handful that are good, and the rest are
Yeah. Yeah,
so.
that's a real problem nationwide. So the scale of the epidemic itself is not that bad in Indonesia at all, especially compared to a lot of other countries in the world. But the capacity of its healthcare system is low, especially outside Jakarta. And Jakarta is the best. The other provinces, especially remote provinces like Papua, have extremely limited healthcare capacity, and so that's a real weakness, and that adds to the importance of testing in order to monitor and keep things in check.
What do you make of the lack of testing, the lack of the machinery, the lack of the reagents? Is that actually what we're facing? Is it a hardware and skills shortage? And if it is, I mean, it's been 6 months. Why are we still at this place, do you think?
Yeah, there's been a lot of promises from ministers about being on the verge of rolling out domestic production of rapid tests and PCR tests and equipment and so on. There have been statements from officials acknowledging that in some cases the laboratories conducting testings have become their own clusters, which intimates that there's been lax standards that have allowed for infections to take place among personnel who are already very limited to begin with. Um,
Wait, so there
eh,
were infections in the hospitals or in the laboratories where they're doing the testing, where they're running
the laboratories,
running the test?
yeah. So yeah, mishandling the samples in the laboratories produced cases among the laboratory personnel. That was an issue that arose in July. Um, there's also questions about political incentives. Yeah, because the government designates regions with low transmissions as green zones, whereas those with the high transmissions are yellow, orange, or red, and the red zone regions have economic restrictions imposed. And so that creates a perverse incentive where regional heads might try to restrict access to testing to keep the results of testing limited and therefore keep themselves within the green zone rather than becoming a red zone. There's also elections coming up, so there's a number of incumbent regional heads around the country who are running for re-election, and their performance is at issue.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that. There's going to be regional elections in December. 270 districts and provinces are going to the polls. What's the likelihood that they'll come off safely, and to what extent are politics hampering, the COVID response?
Yeah, it's inappropriate to be conducting these elections, actually, given circumstances with the pandemic, because these elections are not particularly crucial, really. Indonesia has 34 provinces, and only 7 of those are having elections, and those are all relatively small provinces. So 263 of these 270 regions conducting elections are district level regions below the provincial level. And postponing them for another few months would by no means be catastrophic. I suspect that the 9 political parties in parliament that put forth tickets in these races get money in a lot of cases from the candidates whom they nominate. Therefore, postponing the elections would postpone the cash flow for the party coffers. And my suspicion is that this is why they're pushing ahead with these elections under these conditions, because electoral monitors and NGOs who focus on democratization have been arguing strenuously for postponement, but the parties in parliament, along with government ministers, who themselves, in a lot of cases, are party figures, have committed to carrying them out on 9 December. So it makes it very awkward for the candidates to campaign and to hold rallies, and it discourages participation as well. It puts ballot station workers at risk, and these elections actually, in a lot of cases, have very low turnout to begin with, especially because they're candidates nominated by these parties are often quite bad, and so this is only going to depress turnout even further. So it's all a bit unfortunate and really arguably irresponsible. There's been talk about postponing at least the elections that are in red zones, but officials downplayed that prospect just this past week. So
Jokowi Gibran may have to wait to become mayor of Solo.
Yeah, no, I think they're going to push ahead. Yeah,
Push ahead,
yeah. So
But
the president has 2 relatives competing. Yeah,
yes,
his son is going for his old job as solo mayor, and his son-in-law, Bobby Nasution, is running for mayor of Medan.
yeah. Speaking of local heads, then, is anyone is anyone having a good crisis? Is anyone coming up with their reputation intact and a bit of a track record to show the voters the next time they face them, perhaps for a higher job?
Right. Well, that's one of the issues very much at play, I think, with this current designation of tighter restrictions in PSBB in Jakarta, because the governor Baswedan is quite likely a contender for president in 2024, and he is more or less a figure of the political opposition at present. And there may be an inclination of central government policymakers to complicate whatever the governor is trying to do. And if so, that would be unfortunate in this case, because tighter restrictions seem warranted, but central government is encouraging him to compromise on those restrictions and keep things relatively loose. Other regional heads who have been performing seemingly better are the 2 main ones, along with Baswedan, in the 2024 calculations. That's the Central Java Governor Ganjar Pranowo and the West Java Governor Ridwan Kamil. But the case growth has been accelerating nationwide over the past couple of weeks, and that includes West Java, which is the biggest province and a province that had one of the lowest rates of transmission to date. So his reputation is going to be a little bit at stake there in terms of how the epidemic unfolds, I think.
Mike Smith and I have been friends for 10 or 15 years now. We worked together at the Australian Financial Review for a time while we were both living in Sydney. So when he failed to answer some of my WhatsApp messages and hadn't been on social media for a while, I was wondering where he'd gone. Turns out he was pulling a bit of a Julian Assange, holed up at the consulate on worries that the Chinese are going to detain him, like they've done a few weeks before with Cheng Lei, a Chinese-born Australian journalist with the state broadcaster. Diplomats brokered a deal to spirit both him and his counterpart at the ABC, Bill Birtles, out of the country. Both are wrapping up 2 weeks of quarantine in a decidedly average business hotel in Sydney, and while bored, they are safe. I spoke with Mike last week and began by asking him how it all started. Welcome back, Mike, and it's so good to see you.
Hey, Jeff, it's great to be back again. I think different circumstances than the last time I was on your podcast from Hong Kong.
That's
quite
right.
A few months ago.
Yeah. So you've had a eventful, well, not just past 2 weeks, but even a couple of weeks before that, you got unceremoniously chased out of China, mate. So how did it all start?
Yeah, it's been a quite eventful few weeks. So I'm currently now in a quarantine hotel in Sydney, so sort of nice and safe and can reflect back on everything. But it all started about 3 weeks ago on August 31st. And I just flown into a city in China called Tianjin to sort of do some stories about the economy. And two of my editors called me and said, hey, we've just had a call from someone very senior in the Australian government to say that we should be getting our reporter out of China and that I was in danger. And at the same time, the Australian government announced that that an Australian Chinese journalist called Cheng Lei had been detained. So Cheng Lei is quite a famous TV anchor in China, and she'd sort of been detained 2 weeks earlier. So that was all pretty shocking. Foreign journalists don't get detained in China, or they never have before. This journalist she worked for state media. She was originally born in China, so I sort of thought, well, she's in a different category than me. This is awful news, but I didn't feel completely threatened yet. But I did drop what I was doing, and my bosses and I agreed that I should get on the train and go to Beijing, which is only half an hour away, and go and see the people at the Australian Embassy and find out what was going on. So I sort of headed to Beijing, and the next morning, me and another Australian journalist called Bill Birtles, who works for Australian Broadcasting Corp, we did go to the embassy and had some conversations. Meanwhile, my bosses were talking to people in Canberra, and we were very strongly advised to leave China. They didn't give us any specific reason why we should leave, other than the detention of this other journalist had sort of alarmed everyone. So, I went back to Shanghai, sort of mulled on it for a couple of days. We did take it very seriously. But then the warnings from my government became so strong that me and Bill Birtles decided and our employers decided we couldn't ignore these high-level warnings anymore, and we should at least book a flight and look at going back to Australia for a couple of months. So Wednesday morning, I booked a flight back and did some packing, didn't really tell any of my friends I was leaving. That was sort of the advice I was given, not to make a fuss, and then went to bed Wednesday night. So early Thursday morning, it was sort of after midnight, there was a huge pounding at my door. I live in a sort of old laneway house in Shanghai, and I woke up, sort of, I didn't know what was going on, ran downstairs, opened the door, and there were sort of 7 security officials on my doorstep, so sort of uniformed police, and they held up a badge and they said who they were and asked for my name, and they said they were coming in. I didn't have much choice, and I had no idea what was happening. I was half asleep. So we sort of went into my lounge room and I sat on the couch and they kind of all stood around me. There was a guy with a huge camera and sort of a spotlight on my face, and they sort of read to me from a statement. It was sort of parroting some of China's national security laws, and they were basically telling me that I was sort of a person of interest in an investigation, which later turned out to be the Chunglei case, and that I couldn't leave China. I was subject to an exit ban. So this is really disturbing stuff.
Did you know Chunglei?
Well, that's the whole sort of farcical thing, is like I don't know her. I've met her once in a bar, with, in a room packed full of other journalists. Got introduced briefly. We didn't even have a conversation. So just I don't know her. I don't know anything about her besides sort of her public profile. So the night the police came, they didn't ask me about her. They were just sort of telling me what the situation was. But it was, it was kind of harassment, coming to someone's house that late at night with so many people. And look, at the time, it did flash through my mind that, my God, they're going to take me away here. I didn't know what was happening. So, so that took 5 or 10 minutes and they suddenly left and left the house. Yeah.
And this is being recorded. There's a bright light on you, and there's presumably there's a translator telling you what's going on. Did you have a chance to ask any questions, or
no?
Am I under arrest, or what's going on?
No, so they were sort of reading from a statement which they got me to sign. It was all read out by a translator. But look, actually, I was so freaked out. I didn't actually understand exactly what was happening and what they were telling me. And when they did leave, I did sort of walk out to the door with them, and I started asking them, what's going on? Can I have a copy of the statement? Can I take a photo of the statement? What is happening? And they very blunt. They just said no, and left. But the weird thing was, so I rang this other journalist in Beijing, Bill Birtles, and the exact same thing had happened to him. There was a coordinated visit from these security officials in Beijing at the same time. They came to his place, exact same thing, and we were both thinking, my God, this is political now. That we were the only two journalists left in China who worked for Australian media outlets, because all the others have sort of were stuck back in Australia because of border closures.
And we should point out here that this has been after this steady drumbeat of there's been a diplomatic standoff between Australia and China starting a couple months ago, when Australia called for an investigation into the causes of COVID. That touched off a bit of a trade spat, and I think barley and beef exports or imports into China are banned now. And there's been a lot of back and forth. So you saw yourself then. It was clear to you then that you were like the next rung on this treadmill. I suppose I'm mixing my metaphors, but it's all part of this diplomatic standoff, and you were the next step.
Totally, that's exactly what it felt like. And the background's really important, because as you said, relations between Australia and China have been deteriorating since April. My government sort of very provocatively called for a global inquiry into the origins of coronavirus, which China's very sensitive about. It really annoyed them. And since then, the things have just got worse every day, and China's put restrictions on a lot of our exports on beef and barley, and it's told its students and tourists to stay away. So every day there's kind of this tit for tat back and forwards. And then, then suddenly an Australian citizen, Chunglei, is arrested, and it just seemed to be getting worse and worse. So at that point, it's kind of like we are sort of pawns in this political game. That's what it really, really felt like. It did become more evident later as to why we might have been targeted. This is maybe later in the story, but after I arrived back in Australia last week, it emerged that Australian intelligence officials had, in fact, raided the homes of 4 Chinese journalists in Australia back in June. So no one told us this at the time. All the advice we were given never included this information, but it seems like it could have been a tit-for-tat move because that's how China operates. So you harass our journalists, we harass yours. We don't really know. I mean, this is all speculation still.
And you were saying that it's not part of the regular playbook. I mean, usually, if they have a problem with the journalists, they just don't let them renew their visa, or you just can't come back to the country, and that's that. They've never had a situation where you've been barred from leaving. Not just Australian journalists. I don't think any Western media have had, or any accredited media at all, have been stopped from leaving the country, potentially stopped.
No, and that's why we were probably too relaxed, because there is no precedent for what happened to us. No other foreign journalist has had an exit ban put on them. And I mean, a lot of, more recently, I think more than 17 American journalists have had to leave China. They haven't had their visas renewed. You've got reporters like Chris Buckley at the New York Times, writing these great stories, far more sensitive than anything I've written about things happening in Xinjiang.
Well, he was the guy that broke Xinjiang, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
He got hold of a lot of documents, government documents, and he ended up, he can't go back to China at the moment as well. And I spoke to him last week. He's very disappointed. But in the end, he was sort of, I guess, deported, for want of a better word. So to sort of block journalists from leaving is quite unprecedented. But I think it's sort of a sign of the times. And that's what I was being advised, is that the rules have changed, precedents have changed. So don't get too relaxed about what's happened in the past. So it's a bit of a warning signal for all journalists in China. I think you just have to be wary that the rules have changed. I think Australia is sort of more vulnerable than other countries. We are being picked on a bit at the moment. We rely heavily on China economically, so we are a bit more vulnerable.
So back to the story, you're in your jammies in your living room, scratching your head, wondering what happened.
I'm in my boxer shorts, basically, in a t-shirt. But I rang Bill Birtles up. His situation was a bit different. He was having a farewell party in his apartment, and he had 12 mates round, and a lot of them have been reporting in China for years. And so he was a little bit more relaxed than me, but still kind of obviously concerned. And we swapped notes. And then, of course, I rang my contact at the embassy, and they were sort of like, right, come in, go into the consulate in Shanghai first thing in the morning. So I didn't really sleep that night.
No kidding.
Got up early, went to the Australian consulate, which is sort of in a high-rise office tower in Shanghai, and we had a whole series of very serious meetings, and it was decided that both me and this other journalist, Bill, should be put under some kind of diplomatic protection, and we were at risk. So this is to me, it felt like a really dramatic escalation of what was going on, and suddenly, plans were made. I had to be moved to another location where I could sort of sleep and stay for a long time, and I was sort of put into a diplomatic car and moved there. And, I managed to get a couple of bags from my house. And so it was all quite dramatic, really. I mean, nothing happened to us on the way, but we weren't quite sure how the authorities would respond. So, I went to this other location, and I ended up staying there for 5 days. And it was sort of I was comfortable, but it was sort of a bizarre situation to be in. I mean, you're sitting there going, am I going to be the next Julian Assange? When can I get out of here?
Right.
And it was just more the uncertainty. You didn't really know what was going on or how, you were going to get out of this mess. But
there was conversation. There was negotiations between, I think, Australia and China to try to get you out. And what would it take to get you out? And I'm sure that they were keeping you up to speed as best they could.
Yeah.
But you're in your undisclosed location.
Yes.
Not knowing how long are you going to be there, or whether they even storm the place, because they could, or make an agreement and welch on it. Your world is sort of. Also, at this time, I remember, just speaking personally, I haven't heard from Mikey in ages. Yeah, you weren't on Facebook. You haven't answered any of my messages, and I'm kind of wondering. So, I mean, personally for you, you have family, you got parents. What goes through your mind at this point before we go any further?
Yeah.
Like, how much do you tell? Who do you tell? Like,
Yeah.
how do you make that decision? Or what was going through your mind then?
Yeah, it's really tough because we were very firmly instructed that this had to be kept under wraps. The worst thing that could have happened is our story got out into the media, and it just would have complicated these negotiations. So we didn't really tell many people, and I mean, it was a tough week because my dad went into hospital. He's fine now, so I couldn't tell my family. I did brief a relative and sort of explained everything. I said, if anything happens to me or if it gets out into the media, can you call my parents? So I didn't actually tell them what was happening until I got onto the plane, and they're actually very grateful for that. A few people, I had a few work calls, and you sort of just pretend everything's going on as normal. So that was kind of very weird.
You're actually working. You're pretending to work.
I didn't really get much work done. That was the idea. I did file one story just so it looked like I was still doing something. Wow. Because this Chung Lei's detained, and then I sort of disappear for a while. People might have put two and two together. So you had to be very, very careful. And the irony is, I mean, I think someone said we spend our whole life complaining that the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are very secretive, but when they're dealing with your case, I was actually glad they were very secretive. So I'm not going to complain about that anymore as a journalist.
So eventually a deal was reached, and requiring you to go in to answer some questions for them. It was a 1-hour interview, I understand.
So
about that.
So the deal breaker was, the deal maker was an agreement between my government and China's Ministry of State Security. That's the secret police, the intelligence gathering very serious arm of the Chinese government. And what had happened was that my government and very senior people in the ministry had reached a deal where myself and this other journalist, Bill Birtles, would be allowed to leave China, but only on the condition that we submitted to an interview with the Ministry of State Security in relation to the Chung Lei case. So this was kind of a big deal to get that far. It still was very risky for us, but we sort of figured, well, very senior people are involved in this process. Why would they renege on that? It would be sort of quite embarrassing diplomatically. There was an assumption made that perhaps the authorities in China had sort of found themselves in a bit of a diplomatic mess that they just wanted to go away. They probably just wanted us out of China. They didn't want to be seen to be holding journalists hostage. And, you've got big events coming up in China, like the big import expo in Shanghai. They actually want journalists to come into the country for that. So there was a sense that maybe things had gone a bit wrong, but we still had to go through this interview process to save face. We were technically part of a legal investigation. China has rule of law, so they couldn't just let us go. So there was a deal done that Bill and I would do these hour-long interviews and then walk free. So we were still pretty nervous. We didn't know what was going to happen.
You're going into the lion's den. But just come in to talk. Just come in to. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
What? Are you crazy? I'm not leaving this undisclosed location.
No, and a lot of people walk into these sorts of meetings and they never come out again.
Oh, yeah.
So luckily for me, because this other journalist, Bill, he had to fly to Shanghai Monday morning to get his connecting flight. So because of all the logistics, he had to do his interview before I did. He did it Sunday night, and the agreement was that we wouldn't do it at the same time, just in case something went wrong for the other one. Luckily for me, he went first, so I guess he was the guinea pig. So I kind of knew what happened to him, so I had a bit of an idea of what might happen to me. It was sort of fairly reassuring. Bill's interview sounded pretty standard, nothing particularly probing. So anyway, on Monday was the day it all happened. Last Monday, our flight, we were due to fly it in the evening. I had my interview at 3 p.m. in the afternoon with the Ministry of State Security. I was escorted there with an Australian diplomat. It wasn't in their sort of offices, it was held in a commercial high-rise hotel in Shanghai. We drove there. Two of the security officials who came to my house met me in the foyer. They wouldn't let the diplomat come with me, which was expected. And we went up to the lift to the 31st floor, and we're in this kind of dark corridor. There's plainclothes kind of security officials lurking in the corridors, so still quite intimidating. And then we just go into a room, and the room's been converted into sort of an interview room, and there's just 4 people in the room. One's a translator, one's typing out a transcript, and a female officer sort of questioned me. So this went on for an hour, and the questions are really benign. They were asking me sort of very basic stuff: how long I'd been in China, what kind of things do I report on, who do I interview. They did ask me if I'd reported on the Hong Kong protests. They asked me a few questions about my association with other Australian journalists, and they asked me a few questions about Cheng Lei. Do I know her? Have I met her? Who introduced me to her? That kind of stuff. And I sort of quite truthfully told them that, well, I'd met her in a bar once in Beijing. A whole bunch of Aussies were in the room. I got introduced very briefly, and we didn't even chat. And we've certainly never communicated since. So I didn't really have anything to offer them for their investigation. And they didn't even probe me any further. I didn't get a sense that they thought I knew something I wasn't telling them. There were no sort of probing questions. So they sort of glossed over that part of the interview fairly quickly. So the whole exercise left me a bit bemused. I wasn't quite sure what they wanted to get out of me, and it was obviously such a big deal to set this up. But again, that made me think that this is all part of a sort of a bigger political game. They have to be seen to be going through the exercise of having this interview. But
Right.
But anyway, that interview ended, and oh my God, it's very, very happy when that exercise ended, and left the hotel room. They escorted me downstairs. They're very polite, these people, all the time. There's no sort of bullying or violence or anything. And went down into the foyer and met the diplomat, and we had a sort of 5-hour time frame before the plane took off, and it all went very smoothly. But I was reminded of that scene in the movie Argo when Ben Affleck, Ben Affleck's playing the guy escaping from Iran, and you're sort of thinking, what's going to happen? But it all went quite smoothly. We got to the airport and we got through customs. And once we got through customs, we thought we're probably okay here. That if they wanted to stop us, they'd stop you at customs. The exit bans were interestingly only lifted after I completed my interview. So the other journalist, Bill, was sitting in the airport basically all day, unable to go through customs to the lounge because his exit ban wasn't lifted.
Wow.
So we got through. We had a drink in the lounge. We had diplomats with us right up to the gate. And then we sort of jumped on the plane. And when the plane doors closed and we took off, that was, we kind of thought we were going to be okay, but it was still a huge relief when we were in the air.
And you come back to a media storm. I mean, if that wasn't exhausting enough, but wait, there's more. So I saw a video of you're putting your stuff on the bus to go to the quarantine, which is, by the way, to the listeners, you're in 14 days of quarantine.
Yeah.
And I see you waving to some, to some reporters.
Yeah.
Having to make a statement from a distance.
Yeah. Well, I was totally unprepared for that. I mean, I have little experience being interviewed, and you get off, I had no sleep for 2 days, get off the plane, and you're wheeling your bags up because you have to get onto these quarantine buses, and there's Defence Force people sort of telling you where to go. And there's all these TV cameras just nearby, and they're all waving at me, and I'm kind of like, what is going on now? I didn't know this. I just found out the story had broken, and so I think I mumbled a couple of things, but I was totally unprepared for this media storm. And then the world's bizarre enough anyway with all the COVID restrictions and hotel quarantines, let alone with that on top of it. So got to the hotel, and then I'm on the phone to family, and my bosses and then trying to write a story from my own paper, and then everyone's ringing you for an interview. It's sort of, I'm very unused to that sort of attention, and it's quite bizarre being the story, and I'm not quite comfortable with being the story.
Well, yeah, I was just, how does it feel? I mean, you're somewhat practiced in it now, but I hate being interviewed. I'm a terrible interview subject.
Yeah.
You're doing all right.
I must say, this is one of the most fun interviews I've done because it's a bit more casual and we know each other, so we can be a bit more chattier.
But rigorous and probing, I think, in all the right areas.
Yes.
So to speak. Bit more serious question, though. You and Bill are gone. You mentioned that the Washington Post and New York Times reporters have been pushed out of China too. There's just this this winding down or obfuscation, really, of China. This lack of visibility into such an important country, especially for countries like Australia. It just seems to me to make the situation worse. This is all stemming from a lack of understanding, and now there's going to be even less understanding.
Yeah, it's hugely disappointing. I mean, it's a really disappointing way to leave. There's a complete information vacuum now, and this is a time when
that's an information vacuum.
Yeah,
that's a good way of putting it.
And this is a time when the world needs to understand. It's more important for the world to understand China now than ever. And as you know, a lot of American reporters have been forced out in the last few months. So I think the bureau chief of the Washington Post left. She left, voluntarily this week. But there's a lot of journalists are leaving, and there's still a lot of foreign correspondents there, but it's getting harder and harder for them to do their job. I mean, I found it much harder in the last 6 months. A lot of people won't speak to you. There's a lot of fear about speaking to the foreign media, and sort of even academics and economists that we've been speaking to for years suddenly were denying us interviews. So it's sort of a huge tragedy, and it's sort of going to backfire on China as well, because I mean, all the reporting on China is now coming from outside of China. That's going to take a certain slant, and as you know, there's a lot of great stories and good news stories in China as well. It's a fascinating country.
You get these men and women like yourself at the top of their games, and China specialists, really, who have been pushed out. Yeah. I think Bill is I think you mentioned, is married to a woman of Chinese descent. He speaks the language. I know you don't, but you've worked very, very hard to get to your position too. They don't hand out these positions to everyone. I mean, on a personal level, you've worked to get to this, and it's been unceremoniously ended for you in a way that you didn't like. Just tell me how that feels.
I mean, I'm a bit of a China newbie, really. I've been there just under 3 years, but I met the most incredible journalists in China during my time there. I mean, Bill's one of them, a real veteran, speaks fluent Mandarin. And I mean, there's people like Chris Buckley at the New York Times, and they've devoted their entire careers and their entire lives to China, really reporting on China. They really care about the Chinese people. Genuinely interested in the country. And then a lot of them, especially the Americans at the moment, are suddenly being forced out. So it's kind of your whole world, everything you've devoted your life to has suddenly ended. So it's a big tragedy for them personally, and but it's just sort of a tragedy for the world's understanding of China. There's still a lot of really good journalists left in China. It's not all over, but I think it's just going to get harder and harder for them as time goes on.
Well, Mikey, thank you so much for talking with me. You've been very generous with your time, and I'm sad that we no longer have a China correspondent for the podcast.
I'm still going to be doing my old job. I'll still be reporting on China from Sydney for the next couple of months, and then we have to make some decisions about how to handle that. But it won't be the same, obviously, as being there on the ground.
All the best in your transition, and 5 days and counting until you're out of quarantine, yeah?
Yeah, 4 more days, not
4 more days.
Don't count today, 4 more days. Thanks, Jeff.
All the best. Enjoy your dinner. Bye now.
Thanks very much. Bye.
And that's the program, thanks to Kevin O'Rourke and Mike Smith. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shofwan. Music by Soundstripe. You can always reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. And if you like the program, rate us. It helps. I'm Jeff Hutton. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.